David sat on the wooden porch of his home, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh grass. His small garden stretched before him, bathed in the soft golden glow of the rising sun. The leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and for a moment, everything felt still, as if the world itself had paused to take a deep breath. Mornings like these had always been his favorite. There was something sacred about the quiet hours, before the world fully awakened. It was a time for reflection, a time to listen, not to the noise of daily life, but to the whispers of his own heart. And lately, those whispers had grown louder, filled with questions he could no longer ignore. At 70, David had lived through decades of joy and hardship, love and loss. He had built a life, raised a family, and seen the world change in ways he never imagined. And yet, despite everything he had experienced, he still found himself carrying an invisible weight, a burden not of years, but of thoughts. There were things he had held on to for far too long, the worry of how others perceived him, the regrets of moments he could not change, the quiet longing for days that had come and gone. The world often spoke of the wisdom that came with age, but no one warned him about the doubts, the second-guessing, the nagging feeling that perhaps he had not yet figured it all out. He had spent much of his life believing that happiness came from adding, from achieving more, knowing more, doing more. But now, he was beginning to wonder if true peace came not from accumulating, but from letting go. He watched as a leaf drifted down from the old oak tree in his yard, spiraling gently before resting on the ground. Nature never clung to what had served its time. The tree did not grieve for the leaves it shed. It simply let them fall, making way for something new. David took a slow sip of his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him. Perhaps it was time he did the same. He turned his gaze back to the horizon, a quiet resolve settling in his chest. He would no longer carry what no longer served him. He would release the worries, the expectations, the unnecessary burdens. And so, he began a new journey, not to find more, but to free himself of what was weighing him down. Today, he wanted to share with you the 8 lessons he had learned about finding peace, about knowing what to hold on to and what to let go of, not as rules, but as gentle reminders for anyone who, like him, had reached a point in life where they longed for something simpler, something lighter. And if this message resonates with you, if you too seek a life of quiet contentment, consider supporting this channel. Together, we can create a space of wisdom, gratitude, and the quiet joy of a peaceful heart. Lesson 1. Age. You are more than a number. David sat on the porch, his hands resting on the worn wooden armrests of his chair. The morning breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine, a fragrance that stirred something deep within him. A memory, a feeling, a reminder of time slipping through his fingers. He had been thinking about age more than he cared to admit. There was a time when growing older felt like an achievement. Turning 18 had meant freedom. 30 had meant responsibility. 50 had meant wisdom. But now, at 70, the number felt heavier, as if it came with an unspoken expectation of slowing down, of stepping aside, of becoming less. He had noticed how people spoke to him differently, how they assumed he no longer understood certain things, how well-meaning strangers offered help before he even needed it. He appreciated kindness, but he also recognized the subtle shift in how the world saw him. He caught his own reflection in the window beside him. The lines on his face told a story of laughter, of sorrow, of days spent in the sun and nights spent in quiet contemplation. They were not marks of decline, but imprints of a life well lived, and yet, he had let the world convince him that these lines defined him, that the number attached to his name determined his worth. A memory surfaced, one from years ago. He had been sitting on a park bench, watching an elderly man feed the birds. A child had approached and asked the old man how old he was. The man had simply smiled and said, "Old enough to know better, young enough to still wonder." David had laughed at the time, but now, those words carried a wisdom he only now understood. Age was not a number. It was a collection of moments, of lessons, of the love given and received. The years did not take away who he was. They added to him, layer by layer, shaping him into someone richer in experience, deeper in understanding. He realized then that the fear of aging was not about the passing of time, but about the fear of becoming invisible. But the truth was, he had never been more himself than he was now. He was not fading. He was becoming. He sat a little taller, breathed a little deeper. He would no longer let a number define him. He would no longer measure his worth in years. Instead, he would measure it in the way he lived, in the way he loved, in the way he continued to grow, no matter the number. Lesson 2. Money. True worth is not measured in numbers. David had spent much of his life chasing security, believing that if he worked hard enough, saved diligently, and planned wisely, he would one day reach a point where money would no longer be a concern. And in many ways, he had succeeded. He was not wealthy by society's standards, but he had enough. A modest home, food on the table, and a sense of stability that he had worked decades to build. Yet, even now, in his 70s, he found that money still had a way of lingering in his thoughts. He had seen how differently people treated those who had more and those who had less. He had witnessed friendships shift when financial matters became involved. He had felt the quiet pressure to keep up, to maintain an image, to prove his success through possessions. And he had also seen the other side, the quiet struggles of those who had less, the shame that came with financial hardship, the way society measured a person's value in dollars and cents. It had taken him years to realize that no matter how much or how little one had, money always seemed to create a weight of its own. One afternoon, an old friend visited him for coffee. They sat on the porch, reminiscing about their younger years, the jobs they had held, the dreams they had chased. His friend, once a successful businessman, sighed and said, "I spent my whole life trying to make enough money so I wouldn't have to worry about it. And now, I realize I spent more time worrying about money than actually living." David stirred his coffee slowly, letting those words settle. He thought about the richest man he had ever known. A neighbor who had everything money could buy, yet never seemed satisfied. And then he thought about the kindest man he had ever known. A janitor from his childhood school who had little but always had enough to share. He had spent years believing that financial success equaled peace, but now he saw the truth. Peace was never about numbers. It was about contentment. He thought of the things that had truly mattered in his life. The laughter of his children, the love of his late wife, the long walks he took in the autumn breeze. None of them had required wealth, yet they were the richest moments he had ever known. He realized then that money was a tool, nothing more. It could provide comfort, but it could never provide meaning. And so, he chose to live differently. He would no longer measure himself by his bank account, but by the richness of his days, the kindness he gave, and the love he shared. Lesson 3. Family Secrets. Protect the peace of your home. David sat at his kitchen table, running his fingers along the rim of his coffee cup. The house was quiet now, but it had not always been this way. It had once been filled with the echoes of laughter, the hurried footsteps of children, the late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours. His home had been a place of warmth, of chaos, of love, but it had also seen its share of sorrow, misunderstandings, and words spoken in anger that could never be taken back. He thought about how easily people shared their struggles with outsiders, how family conflicts so often became stories passed around among friends, neighbors, and sometimes even strangers. He had done it himself, spoken in frustration, seeking comfort or validation, only to realize later that words, once released, had a way of spreading beyond his control. There was a time when he had confided in a friend about a long-standing argument with his brother. He had needed to vent, to sort through his own emotions, but he had not considered the weight of his words. The friend had listened, nodded, and soon after, the story had taken on a life of its own. By the time it reached his brother's ears, it was twisted into something unrecognizable, a version that made reconciliation even harder. David had learned then that some things were meant to stay within the walls of home, where they could heal rather than be dissected by those who did not understand their depth. He had seen too many families fall apart over words shared too freely. A passing complaint about a spouse turned into doubt. A moment of frustration about a child became a label they could never shake. A conflict between siblings, once private, became fuel for gossip, turning love into resentment. He had learned that peace within a family was fragile, and once broken, it was difficult to restore. Now, when he felt anger rise, when misunderstandings weighed heavy on his heart, he reminded himself that silence was not secrecy. It was protection. It was the choice to nurture rather than expose, to resolve rather than divide. The world did not need to know every flaw of the people he loved, because they were more than their worst moments. He took a slow breath, looking around his quiet home, and felt a sense of clarity. The strongest families were not the ones without problems, but the ones who knew which battles to fight and which to keep within the sacred space of home. He would guard that space, not with walls or locked doors, but with the wisdom to know that some things were best kept in the warmth of understanding, where they belonged. Lesson 4. Health. When the mind is at peace, the body follows. David sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his hands together to warm them. The cold morning air settled into his bones more than it used to. His body, once strong and unyielding, now carried the quiet reminders of time. A stiffness in his joints, a slower step, an ache that appeared without reason and lingered longer than expected. He had always known that aging came with change, but he had never realized how much those changes would occupy his thoughts. Lately, conversations seemed to revolve around ailments. What medications people were taking, what doctors had said, what new discomfort had appeared overnight. It was as if sickness had become an identity, a defining trait of growing older. He had seen how people, once full of life, had slowly started seeing themselves as nothing more than a collection of symptoms. He did not want to live that way, but he also could not ignore the reality of his own body. One afternoon, while visiting an old friend who had been diagnosed with a chronic illness, David had expected to find a man defeated by his condition. Instead, he was met with a warmth, a presence so light-hearted that for a moment, he forgot the weight of what his friend was facing. They sat in the garden, drinking tea, watching the wind move through the trees. David hesitated before speaking. "How do you do it?" he finally asked. "How do you not let it take over your life?" His friend smiled, placing his cup down gently. "Because I decided a long time ago that I am not my illness. My body may change, but my spirit remains untouched. I can either live in fear of what's happening to me, or I can choose to be here, in this moment, as fully as I can." David carried those words home with him. He thought about the years he had spent worrying about his health, about what might happen next. He realized that in doing so, he had missed something important. The simple joy of being alive, of breathing in the morning air, of feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin. His body would do what bodies do. It would age. It would weaken. It would follow its natural course. But his mind, his heart, his spirit, those were his to protect. That evening, he sat outside, looking up at the vast sky. He took a deep breath, allowing himself to simply exist in that moment, without worry, without fear. He was still here. And for now, that was enough. Lesson 5. Personal life. The most beautiful things need no display, David sat by the window, watching the evening light stretch across the horizon. The world outside was quiet, painted in soft hues of gold and lavender. He had always loved this time of day when the noise of the world faded and everything felt still. It reminded him of something he had come to understand over the years. Some things are meant to be kept close, protected, cherished in silence. He had seen how the world had changed, how people now felt the need to share every part of their lives. Private moments became public displays. Personal joys became performances for an audience that never truly cared. He had watched friends announce their happiness, their struggles, their relationships, as if seeking validation from others would somehow make those experiences more real. He understood the desire to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged. But he also knew that the most meaningful parts of life were the ones that required no approval. He thought about his late wife, about the quiet moments they had shared, the way she would hum softly while making tea, the way her hand would rest on his as they sat together in the evenings. Those were the memories he treasured, not the ones captured in photographs or spoken about to others, but the ones that lived only in his heart. They were real, not because they were displayed, but because they were felt. There was a certain kind of peace in knowing that some things belonged only to you. Love, joy, sorrow, dreams. These were not things to be measured by how many people acknowledged them. They were meant to be experienced deeply, intimately, away from the eyes of the world. David had learned to guard his personal life, not out of secrecy, but out of reverence. Not everything needed to be explained. Not every happiness needed to be shared. Some moments, some connections, some emotions were too sacred to be placed under the scrutiny of others. They were meant to be lived, not displayed. As the last light of the sun disappeared beyond the hills, David took a slow breath, feeling the quiet fullness of his life. He had nothing to prove, nothing to declare. The richness of his existence was not in how much others knew about it, but in how deeply he felt it himself. And in that understanding, he found a kind of freedom that no audience could ever give him. Lesson 6. Giving. True kindness comes from the heart. David sat on a park bench, watching a young boy feed breadcrumbs to a group of pigeons. The child giggled as the birds fluttered around him, pecking eagerly at the crumbs scattered on the ground. There was no expectation, no need for recognition. The boy simply enjoyed the act of giving. David smiled to himself, realizing how pure generosity was when it came from a place of joy rather than obligation. He had spent much of his life believing that giving should be seen, that acts of kindness were somehow more meaningful if others acknowledged them. He had watched people make grand gestures of charity, posting about their donations, seeking validation for their generosity. But over the years, he had come to understand that true kindness did not require an audience. Some of the most selfless acts he had ever witnessed had been the quietest ones. He remembered an old neighbor from his childhood, a woman who never spoke of her good deeds, yet everyone in the community felt her kindness. She would leave fresh bread at the doorstep of a struggling family without a word. She would slip a few extra coins into the hands of a young boy who couldn't afford candy at the store. She never asked for thanks, never sought attention. She gave because it was simply in her nature. David had also learned that giving was not just about money, time, patience, a listening ear. These too were gifts. Some of the greatest kindnesses he had received were not from those who had much, but from those who had little yet still found a way to share. A stranger who held a door open when he was struggling with his groceries. A friend who sat beside him in silence when words were not needed. These moments, small as they seemed, had left an imprint on his heart. As he watched the boy scatter the last of his breadcrumbs, David thought about the kind of giver he wanted to be. He did not need recognition. He did not need applause. He wanted to give the way the sun gives warmth, the way the trees offer shade, without condition, without expectation. Rising from the bench, He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and quietly placed them in the donation box by the park entrance. No one saw. No one needed to. As he walked away, he felt lighter, freer, knowing that true generosity was not in being seen, but in the quiet joy of giving from the heart. Lesson 7. Accomplishments. Let your actions speak. David sat in his workshop, running his hands over the smooth surface of an old wooden chair he had spent the afternoon repairing. The chair had belonged to his father, a man of few words but of quiet strength. As a child, David had watched him work, shaping wood with patience and precision, never rushing, never boasting about the things he built. His father had never needed to announce his skills. His work spoke for itself. David had spent much of his younger years chasing accomplishments, believing that success needed to be seen, acknowledged, and praise to be real. He worked tirelessly, built a career, achieved milestones that others admired. Yet, as he grew older, he realized that the things that truly mattered were not the ones displayed on plaques or written in resumes. They were the things done in silence, with dedication, with love. He thought about the people he respected most in life, not the ones who constantly spoke of their achievements, but the ones who carried themselves with quiet confidence, whose integrity was woven into their actions rather than their words. His grandfather had been one of them. He had spent his life working the land, providing for his family, never once seeking recognition. Yet, when he passed, people from all over the town came to pay their respects. Not because he had told them of his accomplishments, but because his life had left an imprint on theirs. David realized then that true accomplishment was not about how loudly it was spoken, but about the difference it made in the lives of others. It was not in the titles earned, but in the kindness given, the wisdom shared, the love poured into the simple everyday moments. He picked up his tools and continued sanding the chair, thinking about the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Not one of grand declarations, but of quiet, steady actions that would speak long after he was gone. When the chair was finally smooth, sturdy once more, he smiled, knowing that it was enough. A life well lived did not need to be announced. It only needed to be felt. Lesson 8. Insults. Learning to let go. David sat by the lake, watching the ripples spread across the water as he tossed in a small stone. The surface had been still just moments before, calm and undisturbed, but with one single action, the water trembled, disrupted by a force so small, yet so immediate. He thought about how words, much like those ripples, had the power to disturb the peace within him. He could still recall the sting of insults spoken years ago, words thrown carelessly, but carried with him long after they were said. Some had come from strangers, others from people he had once trusted. He had told himself they didn't matter, yet somehow, they had found a place to settle in his mind, replaying in quiet moments, surfacing when he least expected. He had held on to them, not realizing that by doing so, he had given them power. There was a time when he believed that the only way to overcome an insult was to respond, to defend himself, to prove something in return. But experience had taught him otherwise. He had seen how anger only led to more anger, how resentment did nothing but weigh him down. He had learned that responding to cruelty with more cruelty only ensured that it lived on. He thought of a conversation he had once overheard between a teacher and a young student. The boy had been upset, his face flushed with frustration after another child had mocked him. The teacher had simply asked, "If someone tries to give you a gift, but you refuse to take it, to whom does it still belong?" The boy had frowned, confused. "To the one who offered it," he finally answered. The teacher had nodded. "Then why accept the gift of an insult when you can choose to leave it with the one who gave it?" David smiled to himself, realizing how simple yet profound that lesson had been. Words only had as much weight as he allowed them to carry. He could not control what others said, but he could control what he held on to. He could choose to let go. He picked up another stone, tossing it into the lake. The ripples came and went, fading into stillness once more. The water did not cling to the disturbance. It simply returned to its natural state. And so would he. David sat on his porch as the evening breeze drifted through the trees. The sky was painted in soft hues of amber and violet, the kind of colors that made the world feel quiet, almost sacred. He let out a deep breath, feeling something within him settle. A lightness, a release, a quiet understanding that had taken him 70 years to find. For so long, he had carried burdens he didn't need to bear. He had worried about his age, as if the number of years he had lived could somehow diminish his worth. He had held onto thoughts of money, mistaking financial security for true contentment. He had spoken of family troubles to outsiders, only to realize that some wounds heal best in silence. He had let concerns about his health take up more space in his mind than the simple joy of being alive. He had learned that not every part of life needed to be shared, that some moments were too precious to be put on display. He had given freely, not for recognition, but for the quiet joy of knowing he had helped. He had stopped trying to prove his worth and let his actions speak instead. And finally, he had let go of the words that once hurt him, understanding that they only had power if he allowed them to stay. Now, as he sat in the fading light of the day, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Peace. Not because life had changed, but because he had. He had spent years believing that happiness came from holding on, from gaining, from proving, but now he knew the truth. Happiness comes from letting go of expectations, letting go of the need for approval, letting go of the things that do not serve the heart. The world teaches us to accumulate, to collect achievements, wealth, recognition. But what if true fulfillment comes not from adding, but from subtracting, from learning what is truly necessary and releasing the rest? What if peace is not something we find, but something we create by choosing what to carry and what to leave behind? David smiled to himself, feeling lighter than he had in years. He had no need to chase, to prove, to hold on so tightly. He had his breath, his presence, this moment, and it was enough. As you walk through life, remember this. You do not need to carry everything. You do not need to hold on to what weighs you down. You do not need to seek peace elsewhere. It has been within you all along. All you must do is make space for it. If this message resonates with you, if you too long for a life of quiet simplicity and deep contentment, share this with someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like to walk this journey together, consider supporting this channel. Let's create a space for wisdom, for gratitude, and for the gentle beauty of a lighter soul.